I'm going to read a little bit of your bio, but it is incredible and amazing. I don't think I can get to half of it, and we'll still be plenty impressed. We're so privileged here to have Bob Kaplan now a faculty member here affiliated through Clinical Excellence Research Center, but he's also been the Chief Science Officer at the U.S. Agency for Healthcare Research Quality, a place that many of us apply to for money, amongst other things. Associate Director of NIH, leader of many programs and chairs of departments. I can barely keep up with all of these. I see publications, over 590 articles, and an H-index of 117, which Google Scholar places him as one of the most cited authors in science. Many more accomplishments beyond that. Now he's writing a whole series. I think he said he get to 60 op-ed pieces in major newspaper venues across the world right now. But we're going to be talking about many different broad topics. Before we dive into, I think, a very interesting topic that's really going to touch the nerves of many people here. Just tell us a little about yourself. You just had an amazing career, amazing experiences, a lot of students and trainees, all different phases of their career. Where did you grow up? How did you arrive and work on the things you did? And what lessons can you teach us from your experiences?
I don't think about that.
Yeah.
So I grew up in San Diego. I was a surfer, actually, sort of a serious surfer. I used to compete, and for a very brief time, I was a professional surfer, and I know exactly how much I earned. Zero. So I never did.
Can you call it professional?
That's right. Well, I was actually a postdoctoral fellow up here at Stanford way back when, and got an opportunity to come to UCSD when the campus was first starting. And I went there to work with a guy named Jim Bush, who was trying to develop quantitative models of population health. And I was there for a lot of years. And then I moved up to UCLA and so I eventually ended up in San Diego's chair with the Department of Family and Preventive Medicine, which was a sort of an interesting role for a non-clinician. And went to UCLA as chair of Health Services Research Program. And then I went to the dark side. And as you mentioned, I went to NIH and was there for 4 years, and then went over to AHRQ and worked as Chief Science Officer. And so the transition to this talk today is that when I was in government, I served on a lot of these cross-governmental agencies or committees. So, Francis Collins was my boss at NIH, and that the NIH director is on every imaginable committee in government. And Francis didn't want to go to those committees. And so he set people up to represent him. And so for the least interesting committees, because I was the lowest person on the totem pole, I was the person that was sent. And so I learned about all these things, like academic publishing and government's role in those things. I served on 2 committees simultaneously, one at the NIH that was focused on replication in science. And then NSF had a parallel committee, and the 2 of them actually took the issue completely differently in different directions and so forth. So anyway, that's how I got here.
Very good. And you say a little bit, go to the dark side. Is the dark side just different? You've had a perspective from the university department perspective, the NIH, and all around. How different is that perspective, or what do many of us not even realize? Or maybe you're going to talk about that.
No, it's different. So I don't know how many of you worked in the federal government. It's a very different experience than working in academia. So the government is pretty much organized on the military model. And that, it's good if you come in at a senior position, because you're more like, a high-level officer, but there are an enormous number of rules to follow. And I think that it's a really great experience if you have the opportunity to do it. One of the big issues is how long you stay in those roles. Because if you come from academia and want to come back to academia, if you're in government for too long of a period, your CV doesn't look as attractive as it might have been if you had stayed in academia. So some people will go like that. My intention was to go for a period of 5 or 6 years, have the experience, and come back to academia. And others, get into those positions, just love every bit of it, and don't want to leave.
Maybe a corollary to the talk as well. Academia, government, and now you're producing a lot of op-ed, like basically popular press. What is that like, and what do you think has a bigger impact? Journal publication or posted in the Washington Post or whatever it may be?
It's interesting that, the popular press things I think are read by many more people, unless you have, unless you're a high impact author. When I came up through the academic ranks at UCSD, it wasn't just that newspaper pieces or op-ed pieces. It wasn't just that they weren't counted for promotion. It was negative.
Interesting.
And I think things have really changed since then.
Okay.
Back in those days, they would say, well, this person's not a serious scholar.
Right.
Writing things from newspapers. I think it's different now that people are more accepting of public facing pieces, but nevertheless, when people are, I think, coming through the academic ranks, should keep focused on peer-reviewed papers is the central piece, which sort of also gets into the topic for today.
Yeah, very good. Well,
So-
that transition note,
We'll jump into it.
looking very, I've heard a version of this discussion before, which is why I specifically said, Bob, can you come have this talk? Because I think it will really strike a nerve and it's really something we need to talk about.
Well, thanks. And actually, the reason that I wanted to do this is that I wanted to have this discussion. So we have until 1 o'clock.
Yes, so if you can leave some room for a Q&A along the way, if you're able to hang on for a few minutes afterwards, that'd be great, but the seminar will end at 1.
So my intention is to get through most of this in the next 15 or 20 minutes or less, because that I really do want to spend most of the time hearing what you guys have to say about things. So somehow this VPN keeps popping up and I can't get it to go. It's not on this.
Yes, you're good here.
Okay. So I'm calling this developing a strategy to address the crisis in academic publishing. This issue has been around for a really long time. It is something that I was thinking about in government, but most of what I'm going to talk about today has come after the government experience. So trying to there we go. Sorry about that. It's the Stanford VPN is. Let me just close this. There we go. So that I've been writing these op-ed pieces, and one of them had this title, "Let's End the Rocky Marriage Between Academia and Commercial Publishers." And basically, this is the issue, that academic publishing has an enormously high profit margin. I think most people are now aware of this, but much higher than Google and Amazon, which are, last time I looked, about 7% or so. And fossil fuel in good years is 8 or 9%. Also, in many of the years has profit margins way above 30%. It's really quite unusual in relation to other industries. And the way it's done, the reason that they are so profitable is that they get the very best minds who are you to give them copyrights to their work. Most of this work is funded by federal government or other nonprofit agencies. And then, without compensation, they get very accomplished scholars who are you guys to work for free and to voluntarily edit and review the articles. And then once that's done, in other words, once they've taken this product of research that's sponsored by the federal agencies, and then they've got the intermediate work of editing and reviewing done for free, then they turn it around and they sell the product to the groups, the universities that have been paying these people to do the work all along. So in sort of preparation for this and the background for this talk, I interviewed 6 editors. This is what journalists do. I'm sort of learning how journalists work. So journalists go out and they interview people. And I interviewed 6 editors. I promised them anonymity, so I can't tell you who they were. But one was an editor of an internal medicine journal. One was an editor of a rheumatology journal. One was a public health journal editor. One was an editor for an economics journal, political science journal, and a psychology journal. And there were some recurrent themes of what they had to say. So one of the things that they said was that in the old days that editors would send papers to reviewers, and they would send them to the most esteemed people in the field. So if a paper was on some aspect of molecular biology, they would identify the person who knows more about that than anybody else. And in most cases, the person agreed to review it. But when I talked to these 6 editors, it was very consistent across these different disciplines. Editors are sending papers to 15 or 20 reviewers to get 2 warm bodies to review it. And one of the things they said was, particularly the editors that, or a couple of them had been in the business for a long time, is they said that they're just trying to get reviewers. They said the quality of the peer reviews is much worse than it used to be. And they're getting increasing complaints from authors saying, where'd you get this reviewer? The person didn't seem to have read the paper. And the established people are just not responding. And so the editor, and several of the editors said that if you send the paper to someone who is a recognized authority in the area, you don't expect to hear back from them. And there's a second problem that I heard from all of the editors, and then a lot of the other people that I've been talking to about that, and that is that authors are having problems. So young authors can't afford to pay the author processing charges. People feel overwhelmed by the request from journals to review, and that this issue of author processing charges is a particular problem for younger people and for people from less affluent institutions and for people from the developing world. And so there is just a major issue, and it's been described in a couple of different ways. I don't think I'll go into this in much detail, but there are these sort of vicious cycles where the journals have charges that are unaffordable. The institutions can't afford them. Researchers lose functionality. They don't get their work where they want it to be, and so forth. So we know that we do have a serious problem with information overload. This actually comes from a report that Mark and I worked on. But there has been a rapid increase in the number of papers that have been published over the course of time. And this, of course, goes back centuries, but that there is an exponential growth in the number of papers that are coming out. And it's impossible for anybody to keep up with them. But it puts an increasing demand on journals to review them and to process them and publish them. Now, a lot of what I wanted to talk about today has to do with the commercial publishing industry. And the easiest publisher to pick on is Elsevier. They're the largest one. They published over 600,000 papers in 2021, across their different journal products. There were over 1.6 million downloads of their papers. Science Direct had 18 million visitors, and that 94% of the top 100 health systems use this Elsevier Clinical Solutions product. You might ask, well, how big is the academic publishing industry? How large is it? And the answer is, it's really big. That the total global revenues are about $24 billion. Revenues are somewhere between the film industry and the recording industry. So if you think about, writers going on strike and so forth, it's actually similar to the academic publishing industry. It's quite remarkable. Profits for Elsevier in 2019 were about 36%, again, outstripping just about any other industry. And if you think about the most successful magazines, like The Atlantic or The New Yorker, on a good year, their profit margin's about 12%. So just to put the 36% in context for Elsevier. In contrast to other aspects of journalism, the product that academic publishers publish is very different. So again, if you're the New Yorker or the Atlantic or the Economist, you're paying the authors and you're paying the editors, or you're paying the people that do the quality control, which is actually quite different than academic publishing, where again, we assign our copyrights to these journals for free. And then we go out and we do all the work. And again, they turn around and sell these to our employers. So I wanted to just to mention the revenues. So It's a little bit hard to get these numbers, and some of it you have to sort of hunt around for, but Elsevier in 2022 looks like it had a revenues of about 3.5 billion, a profit about 1.8 billion, and then you can see the other ones. It's a little bit hard, by the way, because that now all of these journals are sort of brands, and so BMJ now, for example, it used to be the BMJ. Now the BMJ is actually a tent that has about 125 journals in their stables now. So, and JAMA's the small one, a revenue of 27 million, but actually, I believe that's increasing as JAMA has become a brand with all of its products. So I'm going to take a little detour and talk about history for a while, and just to give you a sense of how I think that this problem developed. And there are a couple sort of important personalities that I mentioned. So how many of you are familiar with Vannevar Bush? No, Mark, that's it. So Vannevar Bush was a very important personality historically. So Bush started Raytheon. In fact, to you information scientists, he built one of the first analog computers in 1924 to solve differential equations. He developed the concept of microfilm technologies and Memorex. But his most important contribution was that he was a major advisor to FDR. And so he was actually working for the White House. He had moved from Boston and MIT down to Washington, where he was the head of the Carnegie Institute. And that he really felt that science was core to just about everything that would happen in society. But they knew the war was coming, and that Bush had gone to Roosevelt and said, in order for us to succeed in the war, we have to have a much better alliance between science and technology and engineering and the military. And so what happened was that Bush had really helped galvanize the role of information and science in the development of weaponry and strategy that was used in the war. And it was very much a success. So after the war, and after Roosevelt had died, he became an advisor to President Truman, in that he had this concept of the research-intensive university. So universities were actually somewhat different. There were research-intensive universities, but in fact, major institutions, the University of Washington and so forth, were primarily teaching institutions. And Bush's vision was that we can create this sort of endless stream of science. And there was a report that came out in 1945 that was called Science, the Endless Frontier. And the narrative was basically this, that contemporary science will solve all the problems of the world. And that the way that we advance science is that we create these institutions, research-intensive institutions. And this is done by sending massive amounts of money to certain select universities to support the basic sciences. And the way that you get universities hooked into this is by having large overhead rates. And so the concept of federal grants going to universities, but then making it sweet for the universities by having large overhead payments was kind of the mechanism that was used to create the modern research-intensive university. And a lot of that money, so a lot of the overhead money was going to be directed toward libraries. And if you go back to the original sort of endless frontier, the idea was money comes to the universities, some of it, is directly related to the research project, but a lot of it goes for central uses, and libraries were very important because that, perhaps more so than today, libraries were the center of the university before the internet. And people spent a lot of time in them. When I was at UCLA and UC San Diego, we had buses that went from San Diego campus to the UCLA library every day, and every morning a bus would leave from Irvine and from Riverside and so forth, and they would come up and people would spend time in the libraries. So libraries really prided themselves on these very diverse collections. And then in fact, accreditation processes looked at library collections as an element for their advancement. So the next thing that happened was that before about 1970 or 1960, most academic publishing was done by university presses and by professional societies. And that around the late 1960s, actually some of this started in the 1950s, that anyway, university presses were doing a crummy job. And if you go back and try to look at the historical record, there were a lot of complaints that professional societies and universities were publishing journals and a lot of books, but they did it very slowly. And processing time for journal article was quite long. So what happened was that commercial publishers came around, they came to the universities and they'd say, this is a mess, because that in order to produce a journal, you've got to have typesetting, you've got to buy paper, you've got to buy ink, you've got to have a warehouse to store these journals, you've got to bind them, you've got to print them, you've got to ship them, and so forth. All things, by the way, that in the current era of the internet, you don't have to do all those things. So, and I'm going to come back to that issue in a while, but there was a lot of expense, and it was just a lot of work that universities didn't pride themselves on doing very well. And so the commercial publishers came along and they said, we're just going to take these burdens off your hand. We'll take publishing over for you in exchange, of course, for money. So I'm going to just mention one more historic figure, which I think is a very important one. How many of you are familiar with Robert Maxwell? So Robert Maxwell was a member of parliament in the UK. He was the mastermind of Pergamon Press, which was eventually sold to Elsevier. He started hundreds of journals, and that eventually sold Pergamon to Elsevier. And by the way, he was somewhat of a playboy. He very colorful character. He died mysteriously.
Who's the woman with him?
So that was his daughter.
Oh,
And she also is famous because she is was the girlfriend of Jeffrey Epstein.
I figured she looked familiar.
Maxwell.
Yeah, why did you know this?
Elaine, is that
Yeah,
right?
Elaine
That's
Oh
Elaine,
my
so,
God, really?
yeah.
Did she kill Robert Maxwell?
So how did Robert Maxwell?
I mean,
So he would go around and start all these journals. I'll just delay this a little bit because it's such an interesting story. So he made a fortune starting journals, and that he did it by, so he was a party animal, and he would go around to the professional meetings, and he would go to the paper sessions, and he'd pick out and he'd say, Mark, and he said, information science, ontologies, you should be the editor of a journal in that area. And then he'd take him out to dinner, and he was able to proliferate lots and lots of journals. And that the reason it worked was that university libraries were getting credit for having broader collections. And so you think if there's more competition, the price should go down. Actually, in acquisition of academic journals, it was the reverse, that more journals there were, the more profit there was, the libraries were incented to buy all of them. And Maxwell had kind of figured that out. So anyway, the mysterious death was that he got into a lot of financial trouble. So he owned other enterprises. So he bought the Mirror of London, got in the newspaper business. He was a competitor for Rupert Murdoch. But he also was suspected of being involved in arms trading, and that he had an allegiance with the Mossad in Israel, and that he had a yacht and he fell overboard his yacht. And he was naked. It was sort of this weird thing, and that some people said he had a heart attack and drowned and so forth. But there's the second, and if you Google, Robert Maxwell's death, that it was in the newspapers in London for years, and that so there was some suspicion that he had been murdered. Some people thought he had been pushed. They thought he might have been assassinated by the Mossad, all kinds of stuff. So anyway, so the next character that I wanted to mention is Harold Varmus, who kind of got me into this. So when I was at NIH, the NIH, as I mentioned, had this committee on replication in science. And it was like just 4 people, but Varmus chaired it. And I got to know him a little bit better. And he had been both the director of the NIH and the director of of NCI, and of course, he was a Nobel laureate, or is a Nobel laureate, he's still alive. And when he came to NIH, he wanted to take on the publishing industry, and he thought, hey, NIH is spending all this taxpayer money. And then the copyrights to this information are owned by commercial publishers, and he thought that was wrong. So he went on a variety of different campaigns and stimulated a lot of this thinking about different ways of doing academic publishing. And he was one of the founders of the Public Library of Science. So when I came back from government, I was asked by the LA Times to comment on this conflict between the University of California and Elsevier. This goes back to about 2017 or so. And basically, the University of California was going to go on strike. They were going to give up they were going to not continue to buy subscriptions from Elsevier. And it was a huge thing. And in fact, there was a period of a couple of years for the University of California, who was the biggest purchaser in the world of Elsevier publications, was not purchasing them. And eventually they've struck a deal. But it led to a variety of proposals legislatively. So one was the Fair Access to Science Technology Research Act, which didn't go anywhere. But it was going to require free internet access to research articles that were paid for by the public. So it makes sort of perfect sense. And that bill died in the House of Representatives in 2017. By the way, that's a recurrent theme. When anybody goes after the publishing industry wins. And that makes our discussion in a while a little bit more difficult. There are also a variety of these things that happen. This is a piece that I did for STAT a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic. And it gets at this issue of, distinguishing between the good guys and the bad guys. And my piece was stimulated by something from the Trump administration. So the Trump administration actually wanted to do what Varmus wanted to do. That they had proposed that any research that was paid for through tax dollars had to be available to the public without charge. And so good idea what Varmus had proposed. But this was vigorously opposed. I guess who? By us. Sort of, we met the enemy and we know who it is, it's us. There was a letter that was signed by 125 of the most influential scientific organizations, and of course, a lot of commercial publishers, which essentially said that scientific articles are the property of the journals because they own the copyright, not of the people. And the Trump administration sort of dropped this proposal. And I think that it's interesting, and we won't go through all the examples, but this is a repeated story. Part of the difficulty with scientific societies is that our scientific societies, which we love and pay dues to, gain a lot of revenue from their scientific publications. And if you look at certain organizations, and I got into this in this piece, American Psychological Association is a really good example where it lists itself as a nonprofit membership organization. But if you look at the revenues they get from dues in relation to the revenues they get from their journal publishing, dues are a tiny fraction of it. And so most of what moves the organization forward is actually money that comes from a very successful publishing enterprise. PLOS is actually a really good example of an organization that's been very forward thinking. And they've been doing a lot of things that I think are very exciting, but they're getting this issue of publication bias because that they say that, scientific report of record is the publication. And by the way, I think it's worth saying that, from the public's perspective, if something's not published, then the research, it's almost as though it didn't exist. So we don't know anything about the research unless it's published, or at least it's reported somewhere. And so part of what PLOS has been interested in is that because of journal selectivity, we don't know a lot about the results of a lot of different papers. We should come back to that investigation. We can come back to that in the discussion period. And also, they point out that it also falsely assumes that the paper, the published paper, is kind of the end of the scientific journey. And I think all of us know that's not true. But from the public's perspective, we publish something, goes out in a good journal, and we think, okay, that's it. That's the end of the story. Where in fact, there are a lot of other, there's a lot of other continued feedback. I'm here today to learn what you have to say about this. So the story continues, that we all learn from each other's feedback. And then plus it's gotten into this issue of author processing charges, which I'm going to come back to. So just like to take the last minute or two, or three, to talk about some of the different ideas that we might use to try to address these problems. And I really hope that we can spend most of the rest of the time talking about this in some sort of open forum. So there are these bold new ideas. Some of them come out of the Public Library of Science. And one of them is that we move to something more like a Wikipedia model. And so this idea that the publication isn't the journalist, it's the end of the story, might move to something like a model where you publish something, but then you're allowed to continue to add data to it over the course of time. Coming closer to representing what really happens in science. We get feedback, people criticize us, we do more experiments, we have more data, and so forth. So I think that's an interesting idea, and it's one that's worthy of some discussion. In fact, Public Library of Science and their board has been talking about issues like this. There are some other ideas that I think are less feasible. One of them is that PLUS has been talking about this idea of setting author processing charges in relation to how rich your institution is. So what might happen is that Stanford, it would take, if you look at all of the institutions, UCSF, I think is one of the institutions that has more papers published in PLUS than anywhere else. And so what might happen is that UCSF and Stanford and UCLA would pay a higher rate because that they contribute a lot of papers and they're both your institutions, and they would subsidize people from disadvantaged institutions. I think that this has no chance of going anywhere, but it's on the table as something that people are talking about, and that type of creative thinking, but I think it needs more critical evaluation. One of the things that continually comes up is that we should just charge more from people who have NIH and NSF grants, and then use that to address this problem of inequality. And the inequality is that people from less wealthy institutions and from the developing world can't afford to pay author processing charges. And I just have to say from my government experience that actually people keep saying NIH has all this money and that we should just hit them for this and that. And actually, I didn't find that it worked that way. That we really struggled to fund as many grants as we could with the budgets we had. It was even more so at AHRQ. So at AHRQ, we had a relatively small budget, and we put caps on grants so that we could fund more. So when you add things that are mandated, ultimately it's going to mean that you're funding fewer grants. I don't think that's a good solution. So for discussion, there are a couple ideas. So one is that we return publishing to the universities. And so again, before 1960s, 1970s, university presses and some scholarly societies were the main publishers. And when the commercial publishers came in and they sort of took that off the hands of universities, that I think some of the problems that we've been talking about today started. So we could return publishing to universities, and here's how it would work. We pay editors. We'd make reviewing part of promotions and tenure. Papers would be published online, and the budget would come from really billions of dollars that we're currently sending to commercial publishers. Here's how it worked again. So universities would sever their relationships with for-profit publishers. They would repurpose the hundreds of millions of dollars they send to these companies. And then faculty would be expected to do a fixed number of reviews per year as a condition of employment. And this would go for research institutions as well. And I don't know if 6 is the right number and so forth, but you'd be required to do it. And the quality of these reviews would also be evaluated by the editors, and then become part of your dossier when you come up for promotion. Again, addressing this issue of people not reviewing. And the editors would be compensated. And again, accepted papers would be curated in open access web files. And basically, there would be a PDF file that gets posted. Format would be constant. You know, there's a couple papers that have come out in the literature showing how much time academics spend reformatting their papers. And if you submit it to one journal and you have to submit it to another journal and they have a different format. Most of us don't care what the format is in. Maybe we have a couple standard formats, so forth. So that's an idea that I'd like to put on the table for discussion. When I published this op-ed piece where I laid this out, I got emails from people all over the place. It turns out there is a group in the European Union that's offering an idea that's not the same as this, but it's pretty similar to this one. And I've been in correspondence with them. So I'd like to open this up for discussion. And so to start this, I got an email from someone who is online, but it's not here today. It's John Paul Cohen, and he proposes that we have a reviewers strike. And I don't know, I think, I'm sorry, it wasn't John, it's Joseph. And I think Joseph is available. I don't know if he can unmute himself, but
Is he online? Oh, wait, oh, I do see, yeah. Mr. Paul Cohen, hands raised. You want to go ahead and open up your mic now?
yeah.
Hey, can you hear me?
We heard something, go ahead.
Oh, great. Yeah, so this idea is if we would like to have journal we would like to have venues and journals and conferences that don't have paywalls and don't restrict access to papers that are published freely, right? So I think reviewers have the control here, and often they don't realize this. So if we only review for venues that match our ideals and are allowing the papers that are published to be accessible freely, and we refuse to review for the journals and conferences that are not releasing these papers freely and are blocking them for profit, right? I think this have this effect where it becomes really difficult to run a journal that restricts access to papers, and it becomes much easier to run a journal that doesn't restrict access. It's much easier to find reviewers, right? So if reviewers just say no to the closed access journals and say yes to the journals that match, that have policies that they like, the quality of the journals that are more freely accessible will improve because you have higher quality reviewers, and the quality of the closed access journals will go down because no one's reviewing. There are no good reviewers for them, right? As Robert said earlier, like the reviewers make the quality of these journals. So this will make the premier journals the open ones, right? And then that will drive authors that want to publish in high impact places to publish in those. They prefer those, right? So kind of naturally everyone would shift there. Like if we look at NeurIPS and JMLR for machine learning compared to the original machine learning journal that was closed, right? All the editors that were big names in the field, right, and respected, they moved to this other journal. So everyone who wanted to submit a high quality paper would submit to the journal that was run by the experts in the field, right? And I think this is kind of the ground solution to start. And I think it'll be a kind of a force on the editors, on the authors. It'll influence them all to shift where they're doing in a very natural kind of market way. So that's the idea.
Great. Thank you, Joseph. So really curious to hear what you have to say about all this. And I know many of you have had experiences, perhaps not so pleasant ones with with academic publishing. So where are we on this?
I think like the computer science type community has like gone way ahead. They just post everything on archive right now. They barely bother with journals, maybe a conference, and things just move so fast. And you just put it online as kind of this real-time peer review. On the one hand, the pandemic, that was really cool. You don't have to wait 6 months to publish things. We need to know something now. On the other hand, people like publish by archive, by press release, and people think people are making decisions maybe faster than they should have. It's a little dicey. I mean, this idea is interesting. If you can coordinate everybody, I also think there's really weird game theory. It's like, well, if you guys all do that, I'm still gonna go do this way and actually I take advantage, right? Yeah, if you can coordinate that, great, but there's some Nash equilibrium that does not play out well if this doesn't do it in having a concerted manner.
So the idea that I've been pushing tries to retain peer review, because I think peer review is central, and it's, it's badging, but also although, sometimes we bristle with the reviews that people provide for us. At least my experience has always been that the paper is better in the long run after the peer review process, and that I think it's core to what we do. You create different incentives to do it, and that that the major feature of it is that again, publishers before provided a lot of services and things that academics didn't want to do. Like they had to print things, they had to buy ink, they had to bind them, they had to ship them and so forth. That's all gone in the internet era. And so would be as simple as getting through the peer review process and posting it. And the universities can pay for it because they're no longer going to be shipping all this money to commercial publishers.
I had a couple of questions online from Keith Morris, Mary Goldstein. I forgot, but basically they're saying, where does like preprinted archives do you feel like fits into the ecosystem? And is that even a useful way to at least timestamp your idea so everyone knows, like, hey, you got here first? Maybe you don't want to be public yet, but you just want a record that I did think of this and I did write, I did the study. And just in general, how does that fit? Because that I feel like wasn't a thing 20 years ago, maybe not even 10 years ago that much.
Yeah, no, first of all, I think that, we're sort of trying to figure out where that's all going, but my impression is that it's here to stay, and the real issue, the component that's missing is the peer review piece, but preprint plus peer review is a good thing. And that again, we can provide some money for it by repurposing some of the money that's spent by libraries, sending to for-profit companies.
And we had somebody from MedArchive here a year or two ago. I think they're basically volunteers from some university like at Yale or something like that, just to maintain the services. And I'm not sure how they're really sustaining themselves. Then also for many people here, some of which I just know, like an editor of one of our medical journals who I don't think allows preprint articles to be published. And so then authors who have to submit, they have to make this judgment call. Oh, do I timestamp this and just get this out in the meantime while I'm waiting 3 months to get through peer review? Or I really want to get into that journal, so maybe I better hold on to it. And I don't know, actually, Steve, you just want to comment, how do you think through that? Put you on the spot, you just walked in. This one, right? Just lines in.
So I didn't think I knew the whole time, so.
I don't mind at all. So we made an exception for COVID, like a lot of journals did, for preprints and COVID. And these days, actually, we've softened our stance on preprints, and I believe preprints are going to be the wave of the future for most journals. What we now ask is that if you have a preprint, you have to send us the preprint when you submit the article, and that may be a factor in our deciding not to take it if we believe that all the information is already out there. And I think other journals are doing something. But we changed if you've encountered that particular rule for our journal, even in our journal, it's been shifting.
It's been dynamic, yeah.
See, just out of curiosity, how many invitations do you have to send out to get 2 or 3 completed reviews?
20.
Yeah, that's the number I used, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
This is totally fascinating. By the way, I'm Kate Miller. I'm from the QSU, a biostatistician at QSU. I have about 1,000 questions, but I'll choose one. I want to just probe. I'm a little doubtful about whether the costs of putting things online really are that much less than ink and paper and sending, because you need a decent website, right? If you're BMJ or even any place needs a decent website for themselves and they need to be able to maintain it, and it's not so cheap to hire good programmers. So is it really that much less?
Well, I think so, but I'm definitely not an expert in this area. So when we were looking at the Elsevier dispute with the University of California, so University of California was paying Elsevier about $43 million per year just for Elsevier. So if you look at the Nature Group and these Springer and all the others, I don't know what their entire budget is, but it's a lot of money. And so certainly there would be some costs in doing it, but I don't think it's anywhere near what the costs of paying for the journals is.
I guess it was a little bit different than I was thinking, like if universities take it over again. That's what I was thinking. In your plan, you had it up on the slide, right? Universities take over publishing again, and it's cheap because it's online. And that's what I was wondering, is really that it's, forget the for-profit publishing.
Yeah, there will be costs. There will be costs, but and by the way, these ideas are pretty preliminary, and so I'm looking for feedback on them. But so I haven't really done the formal analysis, but my guess is that it's just going to be a whole lot less expensive. And a lot of it is, we have Mark to do a lot of it is the organization and retrieval and curating of information, and that we might be able to do that in a better way than it's currently done.
Let me squeeze in another question online. Steve Goodman, do you want to ask yours?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Bob, fantastic talk. Something I'm deeply interested in. Don't know what the solutions are. I think a lot of the horses are already out of the barn, and you're trying to corral them. But I wanted to ask maybe one or two questions. The first one is, and my conflict of interest is I've worked at the Annals of Internal Medicine now for many decades, and I actually believe, perhaps inappropriately, in the value of what we do. And the we is the editors. And I think in the discussion of the economics and the value add of top journals, I'm not talking about all journals, I'm just talking about top journals. We ignore the contribution of the editors. I actually think the reviewers are rather minor in terms of the contribution from submitted to published article compared to the editorial team. But you don't only have those editorial teams when you have the resources to support them. So my question is, part of the question is, if we go to a system with a lot less money involved, and Annals is not one of those that has, I think, exorbitant profit margins. They actually might even be a money-losing operation, but I'm not sure. But they're among the few. What about the cost of high quality editing, not reviewing? We view the reviewers as advisors to the editors, but the editors often know a lot more about the methodology and editing than the reviewers do. So that's one question. The other is an intersecting system, which is that the other conflict of interest is institutions, where we've essentially outsourced the evaluation of our own faculty to the journals. We don't, for most part, we don't read in depth all the articles of the people we're promoting. We get very tied to bibliometrics and journal status and things like that. And as soon as you get a flattening out of the journal system, you're going to have a complete reconfiguration of very rapid cycle evaluation of our own colleagues, which I don't think is good by itself. But anyway, let me just ask those two things and get your thoughts.
Well, Steve, thank you. I mean, as always, thoughtful questions. So the first one is the easier one to address, because the scheme that I was proposing keeps the role of the editors about the same. So what will happen is that a lot of this money that libraries are sending to commercial publishers would be used to support the publication process, which means editors would get paid and staffs would get paid and so forth. And that would be individually negotiated with each of the journals. So they might be named journals, or they might be called something else, but definitely that piece of it still is there. And the reviewers wouldn't be compensated, so the peer reviewers, it would just be a condition of their employment, that they would get required points for their promotions and so forth. That piece is pretty straightforward. The second question, I think, is the harder one, because that there is a badge associated with having something in Nature or Cell or whatever, and that we, that's important for review processes and so forth. So there are other metrics that might be used, so citation rates and so forth, and other aspects of visibility that would be that would provide that same type of prestige, but yeah, we'd have to sort of figure out how that would work over the course of time as a new system got rolled out. Yeah, Jody.
Really great talk, super fascinating. And hearing that you have over 590 publications as I was driving in, I was thinking you could start your own journal. But question I have from you, one, I've been on the editorial board for JAMA Internal Medicine for 10 years, and what I have really appreciated from their annual meetings and their work is their dissemination to practice and how multidisciplinary their team is. And I'm not sure that, maybe there are academic models that could do what they've done, but I've seen the value add in that respect.
Yeah.
And then I was just wondering, from the interviews that you did, if you interviewed in other disciplines, my brother's in astrophysics, and when I've spoken with him, they do the pre-publication to get their idea out. There's a peer review process that starts then. And he was sharing that they've always paid for their publications. And so I'm wondering if you have any kind of a continuum. It seems like Elsevier is the darkest, model.
Yeah.
But might there be some disciplines or journals that do have it right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, first of all, so we have to do a lot of thinking about where this would go, and that, it's following on Steve Goodman's comment, Annals of Internal Medicine does a great job, and as does JAMA and the various JAMA subjournals, and that we wouldn't go into it with any rules. I think that people would have to sit back and say, how are we going to produce the best product at a reasonable cost? But there's just a lot of money on the table, and that, we're paying for a lot of services that we probably don't need. Now, print is going away, but nevertheless, print journals are still being produced in smaller numbers than they were before, but all that cost goes away. And, a lot of the other costs and a lot of the marketing costs and so forth. And so there is, and again, there's a lot of profit. And so all of that would come back and presumably be reallocated for these purposes.
We have to buy stock in Elsevier, obviously.
Or sell it short.
Or sell it short.
Yeah, Mark.
Well, when you talk about disciplines that have it right or wrong, I mean, the discipline has it right is physics.
Yeah.
We would not have a World Wide Web if physicists said they don't need journals. All they want to do is put their articles online and share them. And it's a culture that is very different than almost anywhere else in science. But I think it's one that is going to be emulated increasingly. I think for me, the problem is there's an imbalance between the culture and the technology. Because for me, the whole idea of a journal, sorry, Steve Goodman, is really going away, or has already gone away, because people don't anticipate getting a journal in the mail and leafing through it anymore.
Right.
The unit of measure is the article, not the journal,
Right.
for most people in science. And the journal, the idea of a journal sort of is tied to a mode of communication, which is gone.
Right, absolutely.
And we still kind of hold on to that idea. We think we worry about journal impact factors, our impact factors, editorial boards as if they have, complete control over individual articles. And I think that's probably anachronistic. And the challenge we have is that we have a tenure and promotion process throughout academia, which assumes that we're getting bound copies of papers in the mail every month, and that's going away.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Physics, by the way, so physics was way ahead. They have these rating systems, and they post papers, and people, I don't know if they vote on them, but they rate them. Really, very different model. They have been way ahead. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know exactly where to go with that. But it seems like, first of all, the level of dissatisfaction is very high. And it's one of the things I've learned the last couple of years when I've been talking about this, that if I go out, and particularly if you go out to a group of young people and postdocs and so forth, the rage about, dealing with the publication system is quite high. On the other hand, there have been, and if you go back, there's been legislation, there's been all kinds of things that have been proposed over the last decade or so. And in fact, there have been times when Elsevier's stock dove because that, the build up to the University of California, a policy not to purchase Elsevier, their stock, I think, it lost half its value or something. But it came roaring back. And it's happened several different times now where people thought that it was doomsday for the publishing industry, and each time they get confronted, they come out stronger. Really been an interesting challenge.
Steve had to respond to Mark, and why don't you go ahead and do that, and then I'll go here.
So I think of it as kind of analogous to Spotify, which is that people, the unit of consumption in Spotify is the song. It's not the album. Some of us are old enough to remember album-oriented rock, right?
The order actually matters.
It did, yeah.
Right, exactly. But there is branding associated with the journals themselves. And it's not just a badge of honor, which you were talking about. There's value add, I believe. I guess I have to believe that as a journal editor, but I really do believe it, just like Steve Goodman does. And so I worry that discrimination, and I missed the beginning of your talk, so you probably already addressed this, that discrimination is still important. Because if you just look at citation rates, right now, the citation rates are most correlated with which journal it's published in, not how good the article is. And I don't know that we're ever going to get to just how good the article is, because the vetting process is that the band, not the individual song, the album, if you will, still matters a lot to people, and not just for academic promotion, for whether people believe it, which is even more important.
I just want to make, because we're at one, I want to get one more person, because I saw you had a question back here.
I more had a comment because I thought it was really interesting. It was a wonderful talk. But I feel like this could also spawn more innovation beyond the papers. Like, for example, so in every paper you'd be able to print it as a PDF and you'd be able to read it as such. But being able to present information like visualizations, interactive visualizations, and present your papers differently as well would also be supported by this model, which I think could be a call for innovation.
Absolutely. And just a general comment that this proposal doesn't necessarily mean that JAMA and the Annals and Journal of Medicine go away. What might happen is that the American Medical Association, of course, the American Medical Association wouldn't want it because that it's a very high profit. I looked this up. So it's like the American Psychological Association. American Medical Association revenues are very much tied to the success of JAMA. But the American College of Physicians could have a journal that's run out of a university group, and that we could pay the editors. Everything would pretty much be the same. What you're doing is cutting out the profit, and you're cutting out the remaining expenses that go to high-paid executives and the remaining paper publication. So again, all the details remain to be worked out, and my purpose in doing this was just to see how people reacted to it, but also to try to get a sense of, is this a feasible idea, and are there other ideas out there that are better ideas? I'm sure there are.
Fantastic. I think we'll maybe close like the formal session because we're past the hour now, but if Dr. Kaplan, if you're around for discussion for those, I really appreciate it. Let's thank one more time, Dr. Kaplan. Squeeze in one last question from online, Suzanne Domingue. Computational science researchers are often judged by whether or not they have a Nature paper. How can those who review us for tenure, she's another junior faculty, unlearn that type of thinking? If we assume that's what we're judged by, what else can we do? We have to support the system because we're going to die if we don't.
Yeah. Well, Suzanne, thanks for the question, and so that is really an issue. One of the things there was a piece a couple years ago in The Guardian, and by an American journalist actually, that got into this. And component of the piece got into this whole issue of these badges, like CNS,
Yeah.
Cell Science, Nature.
Yeah.
And they were saying that the publishing industry created this. So they, in fact, Cell, when that came along, the idea was that they were going to publish more comprehensive papers and that they were going to do things that were the highest impact, with the goal actually of being named as the highest impact journal. And that one of the concerns was that hey, maybe commercial publishers are shaping science by getting their high recognition journals, high impact journals, and then forcing a protocol that isn't representative of all science. And that in fact, they were pushing science in a certain direction. I do have to say that some of the work I've been doing recently raises this question. This is a tangent, Suzanne, so if you'll allow me. That we have a project where we independently look at each new FDA approval. And we've been doing this since 2016. So every time a drug's approved, we download all the data and then we look at it independently. And one of the things that has come out of that analysis is that there's been this trend toward approving products on the basis of a single trial. And that happened after the 21st Century Cures Act. So this last year, the great majority of new products were approved on the basis of a single trial. And in oncology, it's almost every new approval. But when we go into clinicaltrials.gov and we look at how many trials there were, sometimes there's 20 trials. Paxlovid is a really interesting example. So Paxlovid got approved on the basis of a single trial. But actually there were 12 completed RCTs and 11 of them hadn't reported their results. And so one of the big issues in publishing is that, we're highly selective in what gets published, and particularly, if it's industry controlled where people might not want all the data to be seen. And so it creates this problem, that we could be making policy decisions based on false positive results, for example. If all of us in the room do a trial,
One of us will find something.
one of us is going to find something. And I think that's an issue. And so these other models that go toward less selective publication, that is, trials get published independent of their results, or there's some reason to compel people to publish their results independent of what the results look like, maybe is better for science. And then people have been talking about this, that a lot of times people are chasing dead ends because that other people that had reached that dead end didn't publish their results. That was I'm sorry for the tangent, but
All good. Mary Goldstein's also giving your hand. If you want to squeeze in, we're closing up, like Mary, squeeze in your question and we'll leave the mic open anyway.
thanks for doing that.
Mary, do you want to ask your question? About if like universities take over publishing?
Okay, I was on mute, so I thank you for offering me the unmute option. Hi, so this was fantastic discussion here about the faculty reviews. I think it is quite possible for them to change. There have been a lot of changes over time with the whole movement of outcomes research and people trying to look at what are the outcomes that matter to people, and with the explosion of information from evidence-based medicine about looking at all these things like publication bias and are these clinically significant as well as statistically significant, et cetera. And I think people in the fields in which that matter, at least as I've seen in various appointment and promotions committee, people do that. And also a lot of people actually do read the articles, the original articles of the people, and not just look at some count in what journals. And I think there are ways that universities can institute some policies that if this change were made, that would be policies for how reviews are conducted that would take account of it. And, I've been in in circumstances at the university where within the small group in the division before someone is put up for promotion, there is a group who is gathered to literally read the articles that are major articles as that person designates them, and to write something up about them and communicate with each other. And so it's a very careful review of the articles. So I think it's possible to address that and bring about changes in how faculty think about things. But the other question I wanted to really bring up was what was kind of alluded to about what are the incentives in journals trying to get high impact factors. And it has long been a concern of mine that some journals want to publish the thing that will catch the news headers the most and get them the most publicity. And that sometimes we hear they change the titles of articles to change a title from what the authors wanted, and to make it something that will catch more publicity. And I think these are journals looking after their impact factor. And I'm wondering if there's the university proposal and there's some sort of expected flattening of journals, as I think Steve Goodman put it, like, will there actually be some attempt to stop that practice? Or, I'm just curious what you think about that practice, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
There's a lot there to unpack. There's a lot of different issues. The issue of promotion, I think, is really a difficult one, because actually, we keep saying, oh, we should read the papers, and we should disregard impact factors and citation rates and so forth. But in fact, people don't do that, and well, maybe they do in Dr. Goldstein's department. What we found over the course of time, having been a department chair at 2 different universities, what we typically get is that the outside peer reviewers count, and sometimes the letter inviting the outside review for promotion says, we don't want to hear about impact factors and, or H factors and so forth. But then we get the letters back and they talk about H factors and so forth, because that we're addicted to quantitative indices. And I completely agree with Dr. Goldstein's comment that we need a better way to do it. We need to take more time and do it more judiciously. I'm just afraid we're not there yet. We have to deal with this. And by the way, so Steve Goodman's comment was also a very good one, that Annals in Internal Medicine, first of all, we all know they do a great job, and it probably is because they invest so much in the editorial process. And so any other system probably would have to take into consideration the good elements of the system and replicate them.
Fantastic. Thank you again, all so much. Thank you, Dr. Kaplan. I'm going to close out the online session, but hope people can also reach out to you, if not now, then in the future, for many other good discussions.
Yeah, I'm just Bob.Kaplan at Stanford